What's that from?
Okay, so as mentioned, you have, for an ecosystem, you have both your non-living or abiotic parts and then your biotic parts. I would also like to point out that an ecosystem is basically what whoever's studying that particular system decides they want it to be. In other words, you can have an ecosystem that is a lake inside a forest, or your ecosystem could be the entire forest itself. Or you could go within that lake and that forest and find a little patch of grass inside there, underwater grass, where you have a whole bunch of different organisms interacting with each other primarily, okay? And the reason why I stress that is that all ecosystems interact with each other, organisms go in and out from them. If not that, when you look at plants and things, their pollen spreads to other places. You know, there's all kinds of transfer in and out. So all of the ecosystems together we call the what osphere?
Biosphere.
Biosphere, thank you very much. So when you link all those together, that's what we call the biosphere of the Earth, all the ecosystems, and they are made up of what I call a base of their physical components, their abiotic components. The number one that determines things is water. That's going to be the number one factor that will determine what organisms live in that particular ecosystem. And then you got temperature, sunlight, nutrient input. Notice I put a dot, dot, dot. There's a whole bunch of different things. Any kind of things, wind patterns, elevation, humidity, all those different physical factors, many of which we talked about. We looked at the other different Unit 1. All those that are not living and or recently living. So I should point that out. There's kind of a gray area there when you look at like organic waste, which was living or part of a living thing, but it's in itself is not living. We consider that still a biotic component. Okay, the abiotic components are things that have not been alive for a long time, or maybe have never been living. Things like rocks and sand and stuff like that, sunlight, those kind of things. It's also not necessarily a substance. It can be like sunlight and temperature. Those are values. Okay. Water, of course, is a substance, but those other things. So that's what we mean by factors. There's kind of a very broad category. Okay. And then you have your biotic components. Those are the living things, and the way we organize those is, as you notice here, we got the biosphere, and that's made up of ecosystems. It's a hierarchy from greater to less. And then you have the community. So very good, Group 8. The community is all of the organisms that live in the ecosystem. That's all the biotic parts of it. Okay. So the community would be the producers, consumers, all those kind of things. And of course, we'll see that lines up in a food chain, something you're probably pretty familiar with. And then you have populations. Now, populations are the individual species. It's an important thing. It might be something new to you. Population is a number of different definitions. A lot of times we think of a number when we think of population, how many of something there are. But in general, in ecology, a population is all the members of a species in a particular ecosystem. So if we were still talking about a lake in a forest, all of the leopard frogs, for example, that were in that lake in that forest. Not all the frogs, but all the ones of a species. So remember your definition for a species is that the organism can reproduce and produce viable offspring. And so that's important because that determines how they will adapt and go through natural selection, those kind of things. And then of course you have the individual organism itself. Okay? So those are your levels of hierarchy. Okay? And then we have the food chain. And although sunlight, of course, is not food, what you have is that's an input. And you take sunlight, soil, air, and water, and things that are called producers, and particularly plants in this case, because that's photosynthesis using sunlight. So they put the food together. That's why they call them producers. They put food together, and then they are consumed by your primary consumers. I don't know why there's an E there. It should not be there. So if you took notes, go ahead and erase that or scratch that out. That doesn't, I have to fix it on the slide, but that's not required. So that's just one degree is another way of saying primary. So you have primary consumers, also known as what? Avores. What kind of avores would they be? Herbivores, yeah. So, yeah, avores. So, when we did the scavenger hunt thing, the tridivore hunt, we talked about this, the primary, secondary, etc. These particular classifications are not that strict. A lot of animals are omnivores, like we are, like bears and dogs and pigs and things like that, just to name a few that you might be familiar with. They're what they primarily consume is going to be where we put them, where we designate these. So technically, people, for example, if we look worldwide, the majority of people on Earth, the majority of their diet is grains, corn, wheat, or rice. And so people would be considered in that case, for the most part, a primary consumer. A lot of people think we're at the top of the food chain. But this goes by what that organism eats most of the time. Okay? And particularly when we get up to tertiary consumers, there's a lot of crossovers. Tertiary consumers are oftentimes eating primary consumers. It's just that there's the secondary consumer is a part of their diet, a relatively large part of their diet. If you're looking for examples of this, I always like to point to birds of prey, eagles and hawks and things like that, and falcons, because they do tend to eat pretty much anything. They're very effective predators, so they'll eat snakes and other kinds of things, and small mammals and other things like that are primarily carnivores. So that makes them a tertiary consumer. And then you have your decomposers. So hopefully remember back, we focus on this a little bit. Very important role in the ecosystem. These organisms are not what we call detritivores or scavengers. A buzzard or a vulture is not a decomposer. Neither is a worm. Those are not decomposers. Those are animals, organisms. Your decomposers are all going to be either funguses or bacteria. Most of them found in the soil. And they can actually, they have what makes them special is they have the enzymes and everything capable of completely breaking down any of the organic waste. And organic waste is two main things. It's waste that the organism releases, the poo-poo and the pee-pee, if you will. And it's the dead body of those organisms when they die. Okay, so all those, everything, you know, there's something that we'll tend to say there, everybody poops, everybody dies, okay? And same thing happens in nature, and of course in nature, most of the time, that means that organism is going to be either doing its excretion into the soil, on land of course, and when it dies, it's probably going to fall down and die and land in the soil. We of course as people don't do that, but usually. But the organisms out in the environment do, and that is why you find most of your decomposers in the soil. That's where the stuff is going to be for them to eat. So once they eat that, the biological molecules, the proteins, carbohydrates, and fats that make up your dead body and also are in your waste, you may not know that, but it's in there too still, they will break down all the carbon in there into carbon dioxide, which will float off in the atmosphere, and then they will leave behind, this is the important part, they will leave behind the minerals in here. And that's going to be things like calcium, iron, nitrates, phosphates, those kind of things that plants need and we also need, but they're not organic. They don't have carbon in them. The plants get the carbon part from the carbon dioxide they absorb out of the air during photosynthesis. But they need those minerals, so that's a big input from it. We also learned just the last section with the lithosphere that the other big input, the main input really from it is the sediments that are in the soil. But these are nature's recyclers, so they're taking some of that organic waste and putting it back into the system. Okay. Any questions? Food chain, abiotic versus biotic, things like that. Okay. All right. There is a principle of the food chain that's very important and has a number of effects and also determines basically how an ecosystem will be structured. And that is the ecological pyramid. And that is based on the fact that when you eat, you're going to excrete a lot of it and you're going to burn up a lot of it for energy. There's only going to be about, on average, about 10% that actually goes into your body tissues and either builds or repairs your tissues, your muscles, your blood, all that other kind of stuff. And of course, that gets less and less as you get older. But only about 10% on average is there. And therefore, since in the food chain, what builds up your body is going to end up being passed on to whatever eats you. then they only receive, the next level only receives about 10% not only of the energy, but also the biomass, the mass itself. So that's what we eat for. Okay, when you look at a nutrition label on a wrapper, it tells the calories and stuff. One of the first things they'll put is they'll put calories on there. Calories is energy. So we eat food to get our energy, etc. That's what other organisms do eat it for. But we also eat food for the building blocks. So if you look at the ingredients, or you look at the things, fats, carbohydrates, those kind of things, those are the building blocks that we can use to build our bodies up or repair it. And so that's the second thing. We call that biomass. Okay, so energy and biomass. And so those will transfer from one, only about 10% will go from one level to the next. That's what we call trophic level. These are your trophic levels. Producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, those are all trophic levels. Is it get off your phones if you are? Put them down, please. All right, so what that means then is that you're going to have a certain amount of each type of trophic level, each organism at each level that is 10% of what was below it. So for example, or you're going to have 10 times as much below as you had above. For example, there are about 10 times as many producers in any given ecosystem as consumers. And you know that when you walk out into a forest or a grassland or things like that, the first thing you see are what? Walk in the forest, what do you see? Trees, plants, grass, those are your producers. So you have to have a lot of those in order to feed the next level, because they're only going to get 10% of what the producers get from the sunlight, from the surroundings and things like that. So then you go up one, you might see some consumers. Let's say you're in a forest, walking around, you see the trees first, and then you maybe see some squirrels. Squirrels are primary consumers. Now there may be some exceptions in certain areas where there happens to be a lot of predators, but in general, you're going to see, when you see animals, you're going to see primary consumers first. And then that will be followed by your secondary consumers, your predators. And where are we at here? Producers, primary consumers, 10 times as many primary consumers as secondary consumers, and so on. It's a dot, dot, dot. And in most ecosystems, most food chains are go up to 3 levels of consumers. Some go more, but just each level goes up, you're going to have 10% below it. Okay. That's known as your ecological pyramid. It doesn't look that much like a pyramid because it's 1/10. So we talk like that much there, and then that much there. And this is your producers, primary consumer, secondary, and so on. I got diagrams for you guys to look at on that. Okay, so that's what you'll see. That's how much is there. That's how much. It's also energy works the same way. You get 10 times. You get 1,000 kilowatts of energy absorbed by the plants from the sun. And then when the primary consumers consume that, they're only going to get about 100 kilowatts of that energy, and so on. So it's a pyramid of both mass and energy. Right? Those are 2 things. All right, any questions about the ecological pyramid? Why it is, what it is? All right, this leads to a phenomenon known as biomagnification. And, well, no, we're not going to talk about that first. We're going to talk about there's 2 there. You guys need to make sure you're clear on this because there are 2 processes that sound similar and have similarities but are definitely different. You need to make sure you understand this comparison here. That's between bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Okay? So let me give you some ideas about that. First of all, this has to do with toxic substances in the environment. That's why it's very closely related to human impact, anthropogenic impact, because we pollute, we put toxic things out there. And what the bodies of most organisms that are vertebrates do to them. Anything that has a liver. Livers are designed to handle toxins, so the ability to handle toxins when they encounter them is one of the things that was just evolved in later these types of animals. Okay, and basically what it is that when an organism, a vertebrate animal, say a fish, encounters a toxin, whether it's in its food or it's absorbing it from its environment, it gets into its body. The body has a mechanism whereby, usually through the liver, that's why you get liver damage from toxins, it will shunt that, move those toxins off so they go right into usually your fat. Okay. The reason why the body does that is to keep them from circulating throughout the system like if it was food or sugar, whereas it would go in, it would go through your liver first, it would go through your stomach first, of course. It gets absorbed, runs through the liver, then it goes through all throughout your bloodstream, your brain, all those other kind of things to nourish your body. If it's something good for you, that's what you want to do, and finally gets excreted. But if it's a toxin, that's going to go, if the body allows it to do that, it's going to go all through everything, your brain, your kidneys are very sensitive to toxins and things like that, and it's going to mess up your whole body. So vertebrate animals have this evolved strategy where they tend to, when they encounter toxins, rather than doing that, they just kind of store them away in their fat tissue. Fat tissue is real good for that because fat tissue just kind of sits there. It doesn't have a lot of blood supply to it, and so it just is storage, that's broken off a little bit at a time when the animal needs it, or it's insulation, and therefore it'll stay in that fat tissue and be kept away from the rest of the organism's body. That's called bioaccumulation. Accumulate means to build up over time. So a little fish, when it's young in a toxic environment, over time will get more and more of this toxin built up in it when it gets older. Questions about that? Okay. All right. Now there's another bio blank called biomagnification. That's what we're going to talk about now. So biomagnification happens through the food chain as you go up, and it is a result of the ecological pyramid and the fact that organisms don't break down and excrete toxins like they do with their food. Okay? So part of the reason why only 10% of the food gets passed from one level to the next here is because this organism, the producer or the primary consumer, is using it. It's using it up for its own purposes. But as we just said, with toxins, the organisms don't do that. They don't use it. They store it away. So consequently, you get about the same amount, very little reduction, of toxin passing from one step in the food chain to the next. Okay? So what that means is that you end up biomagnifying. And I've got a diagram to show this a little bit better, but I'll put it here. See if I got room in that. So let's say you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 dots here. You would have about the same. We'll say the body excretes one of those dots rather than, normally it would be with 10 dots here, if it was food, you'd only get one dot passed up, right? 10%. But this is not food. The organism doesn't burn it up and use it, so it stores it away. So you're going to end up, let's say, with 9 dots up here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. As you can see, it's much more concentrated when you get to there. And then therefore, if you go up to here and you're going to maybe pass 8 along, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, you can see that the top levels of the food chain end up having the highest amounts of toxins in them. Okay. So biomass decreases at each trophic level. So that is called biomagnification. I've got some diagrams in the slides itself that maybe better illustrate that. Reduces. Okay, so you're basically, just think of this like an upside down funnel. You're basically pushing it up into there. The further it goes up in the food chain, the more squeezed in and compacted together it gets. If it were food, you would be cutting it off 90% each step along the way, and that's how it fit up into the upper levels. But it's not, and so you're having to push almost all that up in there, and then it gets all crammed up and concentrated at upper levels. They discovered this when bald eagles and in particular other birds of prey that ate fish were dying, and people weren't hunting them. So that was, they reeled that out, and then of course they went in and looked in the nest to see what's going on. And the eggs were broken before they could, the chicks could develop. And so they analyzed the eggs, and they found out the eggs had high levels of DDT. So DDT is a pesticide that used to be used a lot. It's an insecticide. It kills mosquitoes and a bunch of other stuff. And the problem was that they noticed is that it was not, they were finding this in eagles that were hundreds of miles away from any farms. So the next thing you do from there, when you rule out environmental, as in direct environment around them, getting it from there, you look at what they're eating, so they follow the food chain. And when they did that, they looked at, and eagles, bald eagles like to eat fish. and they looked at the fish, and they looked at the fish that they ate, and they noticed, okay, this one's got DDT in it too, but it's not as concentrated. So they would go down the food chain, or up the food chain, down the food chain. Yeah, down the food chain, and each level the concentration of DDT would get less, which would not be what you'd imagine. You think as you go from one thing through the next, it would start out a lot and then get less as you go up, right? Well, that's not what they're finding. They're finding out you had a lot here, and then it was getting less as you went down up the food chain. Whatever, you get the picture. So that's how they discovered this process. They figured it out. It has to do with the ecological pyramid, etc. Questions about biomagnification or bioaccumulation? So when we test on this later, you're going to need to make sure you understand the difference. They can be confusing between the two. All right, so productivity. So we've talked a lot about biodiversity already in class. Productivity is actually a very simple concept. It's just the amount of photosynthesis that's happening in an ecosystem. It's very easy to measure. They generally, actually what they do is they'll measure the oxygen levels over a period of time. And then that's of course because photosynthesis produces oxygen. Oxygen is easy to measure without damaging the plants and things like that. And since this is, so what kind of organisms do photosynthesis up here? Producers, notice the term, productivity producers. See? So just basically how much photosynthesis is going on, and you could say it's how much life is in that ecosystem. But as we mentioned in here, that's not the key factor as to how healthy an ecosystem is how much living organisms are present there. It's the number of different types, number of different species, which we call biodiversity, or species richness is also a term that's out there somewhat. I'm not sure what the difference is, to tell you the truth. Okay. Any questions about what productivity is? Okay. So a couple of numbers, you'll need to be able to know this. It's a little math thing we're going to have to do here. A couple of numbers that you have in productivity. You have something called gross primary productivity, which is, as it says, the overall photosynthesis. You can measure it, like I said, by measuring oxygen levels, but it's usually given an energy value because that's what photosynthesis does. It makes energy. However, they have a designation to indicate what happens in going to the next level, how much of it's passed on the next level. That amount that's passed on the next level is the net primary productivity. And this relates back up here to this. So in general, on average, your net primary productivity is going to be 10% of your gross. But that number can vary quite a bit. Okay, so the reason why the producers don't store up all that energy is because they use some of that, and they use it through plant respiration. Now, it is cellular respiration group 4, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the point for that. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that plants respire too. They have mitochondria in their cells. When they make glucose, they have to break it down. They have to absorb oxygen from the environment to do that. And that's why, for example, when you overwater a plant, you kill it. The reason what you've done is that you've drowned it, because most plants get their oxygen and absorb it through their roots. And so if it's constantly wet, if it's not adapted to that, of course aquatic plants are different, but if it's not adapted to the roots being underwater all the time, then it will kill it. You know, and we'll see that when some of those floodwaters recede and stuff will kill the grass and stuff. So that's what the plant uses up. The gross is what total amount of photosynthesis goes on, and then plant respiration is a portion that it uses up, and that leaves over our net primary productivity. Questions about that? All right, I'm done discussing that.